Greetings. I am Samuel Cole, an archivist and historian in Oldford, and by some accounts a wizard of some skill. I am putting quill to parchment to record impressions of my friend and colleague, the young half-elven paladin Berevan. Berevan, usually called Berri, was one of those men whom a stranger might misjudge in the first minute and spend years correcting himself thereafter. To look at him, one saw at once the handsome paladin, broad-shouldered, bright-eyed, fair in bearing, clad in the white and gold of holy service, and carrying himself with that natural martial dignity some men never acquire, no matter how fine their armor. Yet anyone who knew him well understood that appearances, in Berri's case, told only the easiest and least interesting part of the story. He was never a simple figure, though he was in some ways a simple man. He was brave, but not always. Pious, but rarely at peace. Strong, but often shaken. Capable of astounding grandeur one day and painful uncertainty the next. If I speak warmly of him, it is because warmth is due. If I speak plainly of his failings, it is because he himself left no room for dishonest praise. He belonged to the Holy Order of Jumel, and that fact sat at the center of his life whether he wore it lightly or under crushing weight. He had come east on a sacred charge, to recover Aeolus, an elven ring of extraordinary antiquity and power, a relic whose importance far exceeded the understanding of most who heard its name. To Berri, it was no mere treasure. It was duty, inheritance, burden, and wound all at once. The ring stood bound up with the destruction of his home, with the death of his family, and with his oath against the enemy he believed had profaned all he loved. That enemy, in time, would take the form of General Cassor, and behind that face yet another shadow. But Berri's relation to the matter was always intensely personal. Others might speak of strategy, empires, arcana, or hidden conspiracies. Berri felt it first as an injury to the soul. It would be wrong to paint him as a clean, heroic type, one of those storybook paladins who stride through history without inward contradiction. Berri was never that man. He was, for one thing, plainly limited in judgment. I do not say this unkindly. Those who traveled beside him could not help but notice that his understanding of events was sometimes shallow, his reasoning abrupt, his confidence oddly placed, and his grasp of more subtle matters unreliable. There were moments when he seemed almost childlike in how he reached for explanations, or when his courage and conviction outpaced his comprehension entirely. Yet what would have made another man ridiculous never quite did so in Berri, for the simple reason that there was too much else in him. His deficiencies were real, but so were his sincerity, his emotional openness, and the unmistakable mark of divine favor that clung to him even in periods of disgrace. And disgrace did come to him, as it comes to many earnest souls whose vows are heavier than their strength. Berri's life was marked by repeated crises of faith, though it is not quite right to call them crises of belief. He did not often doubt that the gods were real. The trouble ran deeper and nearer the bone than that. He doubted himself. He feared he had failed what heaven had asked of him. He recoiled from the possibility that he was unworthy of the charge laid upon him, and when he faltered, he felt the wound of it with terrible immediacy. This was never more apparent than in the matter of his oath of vengeance. At a crucial hour, he failed to pursue the destruction of the enemy he had sworn to bring down, and by that failure he lost, for a time, the favor that had sustained him. Thereafter he suffered not only shame, but a kind of spiritual severance, as though the gods themselves had withdrawn their hand and left him to contemplate what remained of him without it. This would have ruined a lesser man or a prouder one. It did not ruin Berri, though it bent him badly. What must be understood is that he was never admirable because he was consistently steadfast. He was admirable because, having failed, he still found his way back. He could sink into hesitation, into fear, into the wretched self-knowledge of one who has betrayed his own highest cause, and yet some core in him continued to turn toward the good. He was not heroic in the polished sense. He was heroic in the recurrent sense. He returned. This, to my mind, was his true sanctity. Not perfection, but repeated reorientation. Not spotless virtue, but renewed willingness. If I dwell on his instability, it is only because the other side of him was so magnificent that one must understand the whole man to appreciate it. For Berri, all his uncertainty, all his spiritual trembling, had moments in which he rose into something almost terrifyingly splendid. There were times when it seemed the heavens took hold of him directly and made of him a weapon. At Ulcaster's tower, when a Shoggoth guardian emerged and threatened what might well have been a massacre, Berri struck with such impossible force under the power of divine smiting that he all but annihilated the horror where it stood. It was the kind of deed that companions recount for years, half laughing, half shuddering, because no sober plan could have counted on it. And yet, it happened. Such moments were essential to understanding him. Berri was not dependable in the ordinary managerial sense. But in the great hour when fate grew theatrical and terror pressed close, he sometimes became extraordinary beyond any reasonable measure. The same could be said of his final confrontation with the enemy he knew as Cassor, who proved in truth entangled with the magician Magrel Rozak. Here again, Berri's life gathered into a single knot. Oath, shame, relic, vengeance, holiness, deception. He came into that reckoning as a compromised man, one who had already failed once where it mattered most. Yet in the confrontation itself, as his enemy sought mastery through means both profane and cunning, Berri rose again. The record makes plain that his holy power, lost in his failure, returned as he recommitted himself to the work he was sworn to do. It is hard to write of such scenes without sounding too poetic for the tastes of sober readers, but there are times when sober prose must admit its limits. He looked less like a penitent in that hour than like a man remembered by God. I should also speak of his tenderness, for it is too easy when recounting warriors to write only of steel and vows. Berri cared for people deeply and often unexpectedly. His instinct to heal was as strong as his instinct to strike. From the earliest days of the company, he used his gifts to preserve comrades in the thick of danger, laying hands upon the wounded without calculation and putting himself where harm was greatest if another life depended on it. This was not simply duty. There was in him an unguarded quality of affection that made him attach himself in places where a colder or more orderly man might have remained aloof. His bond with Jerupa Blood Sage is sufficient proof that his heart did not consult neat moral categories before choosing where to care. Whatever others made of that attachment, it revealed something important. Berri's loyalties were not abstractions. He could love the compromised, pity the fallen, and remain emotionally open in a world that rewarded hardness. He also possessed a charisma of a peculiar sort, not the polished grace of a courtier, nor the penetrating wit of a scholar, but something more bodily and immediate. He was handsome, certainly, and this did not escape notice. Yet his social effect came just as much from his blunt sincerity, his visible devotion, and that strange blend of innocence and force he carried with him. He could be winning without intending it, commanding without elegance, and affecting in ways that cleverer men often are not. People responded to him because they sensed, correctly, that what he showed was usually what he was. He was not subtle, but he was rarely false. There remains, finally, the question of the deeper mystery around him. Too many signs gathered around Berri for one to dismiss them as coincidence. Arkstones reacted to his touch. Men of darker knowledge regarded his soul as unusually pure, potent, or useful. Aeolus itself seems to have stood in some peculiar relation to him, as though he were more fitted to bear it than others could be. Whether this arose from divine election alone, or from some older continuity of soul, I will not pretend to settle. Others have speculated on grander identities and ancient returns. It is enough for this account to say that Berri was plainly more than he appeared, and perhaps more than he himself understood. The hidden powers of the world seemed to recognize him long before he could make coherent sense of himself. If I were asked, then, to sum him up in honest terms, I would say this. Berevan was a damaged, beloved, grace-marked paladin whose life was shaped by sacred burden beyond his full capacity to bear it. He was not wise in the worldly sense, nor resolute without interruption, nor holy in the tidy way devotional tales prefer. He was frightened sometimes. He was rash sometimes. He was occasionally foolish, occasionally glorious, and often both in the same season. Yet he kept returning to his vows, kept caring for others, kept rising when called, and in the end proved that the worth of a man is not measured solely by steadiness. Some are chosen not because they are strongest, but because, for all their cracks and confusions, they continue to answer. Berri was one of those. He faltered disgracefully at times. He also stood at other times like a sword lifted by a hand not wholly his own. That he was never equal to the whole burden laid upon him only makes his history dearer to those who knew him. It is easy to admire the perfect knight. It is harder, and perhaps truer, to love the one who trembles and goes forward anyway.